When Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, most of the German high command barely reacted. They weren't afraid. In fact, many of them were amused. To the Nazi leadership, America looked weak, spoiled, soft. A country obsessed with Hollywood movies, jazz music, refrigerators, and fast food. German propaganda painted Americans as lazy consumers with no discipline and no stomach for real war. And at first, the battlefield seemed to prove them right. In North Africa, inexperienced American troops collapsed under German attacks. Nazi officers laughed at them. Some even wrote home claiming the Americans would never survive a real European war. But within 3 years, those same German commanders would be describing the United States as something far more terrifying than they ever imagined. Not because American soldiers followed the rules of war, but because they did. And the first crack in Germany's confidence appeared after a disaster that fooled them into believing victory was guaranteed. In early 1943, American troops faced the Germans in major combat for the first time at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, and it went horribly. The German Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel tore through inexperienced U.S. forces with brutal efficiency. American units panicked. Defensive lines collapsed. Tanks were abandoned. Entire formations retreated in chaos across the desert. To German commanders, this battle confirmed everything they already believed. The Americans were amateurs. Their officers lacked experience. Their soldiers looked unprepared. Compared to the battle-hardened Wehrmacht, the U.S. Army seemed clumsy and disorganized. German troops mocked the Americans openly. Some described them as tourists wearing uniforms. Others believed the United States simply didn't have the mentality needed for modern warfare. But Germany completely misunderstood what they were seeing. The Americans at Kasserine were not the finished product. They were the beginning. Unlike many European armies trapped inside rigid military traditions, the U.S. Army adapted at frightening speed. Officers were replaced. Tactics were rewritten. Training changed almost overnight. Mistakes were studied aggressively instead of hidden. And within months, the same army that had collapsed in Tunisia started becoming something entirely different. German commanders slowly realized they were fighting an enemy that learned faster than anyone they had ever faced before. But what truly started to unsettle them was American equipment. It was the behavior of ordinary American soldiers on the battlefield. The German military believed war was a science. Every movement was planned. Every order traveled carefully through the chain of command. Discipline and structure were everything. The American army looked completely insane by comparison. German officers became deeply frustrated trying to predict how Americans would fight because American soldiers constantly ignored traditional doctrine. They improvised. They experimented. They adapted in real time. And worst of all, sometimes it worked brilliantly. If a German officer was killed during battle, units often slowed down waiting for new commands. But American soldiers operated differently. If a lieutenant died, a sergeant might immediately take over. If the original attack plan failed, Americans often invented a new one on the spot without waiting for permission. To the Germans, this behavior looked reckless, but it made the Americans unpredictable. There's a famous quote often attributed to frustrated German officers during the war. The reason the American army does so well in wartime is because war is chaos, and the American army practices chaos every day. Whether the quote is perfectly authentic or not, the meaning reflected a very real fear spreading through the Wehrmacht. American soldiers constantly did things no military academy would teach. Sherman tank crews welded extra armor onto their vehicles using scrap metal. Infantry units strapped sandbags onto tanks for extra protection. In Normandy, American troops even created massive steel blades to cut through the dense hedgerows after German defenses kept trapping them. Other armies waited for official solutions. Americans built them in the field. German defensive positions became harder to predict because Americans refused to behave logically. Tanks crashed through buildings instead of taking roads. Soldiers attacked from impossible angles. Small units kept improvising under pressure instead of collapsing. The Germans realized something deeply unsettling. You can prepare for a disciplined enemy, but how do you prepare for an enemy that keeps changing the rules in the middle of battle? And while German officers struggled to understand American improvisation, another nightmare was already descending from the sky. German infantry feared many things during World War II, but few terrified them more than American artillery. At first glance, German artillery seemed just as powerful. The Wehrmacht had deadly guns and experienced crews, but there was one massive difference: speed. The American artillery system operated with terrifying efficiency that German soldiers could barely understand. Every American unit had radios. Communication moved instantly across the battlefield. If a squad encountered resistance, coordinates could be transmitted within seconds. Then came the explosions. American artillery commanders developed a devastating system known as time on target, or TOT. And to German survivors, it felt almost supernatural. Normally, artillery shells arrive in waves. One explosion gives soldiers a few seconds of warning before the next impacts. That tiny delay often saves lives. Todt eliminated the warning entirely. American Fire Direction Centers calculated the exact flight time for shells fired from dozens of artillery batteries spread across miles of terrain. Guns fired at different moments with mathematical precision, so every shell landed simultaneously. The result was horrifying. No warning whistles. No time to hide. 1 second, German soldiers were marching or eating or setting up equipment. And the next second, an entire area exploded all at once. Veterans described it like the sky itself collapsing. Entire units disappeared before they even realized they were under attack. Roads became infernos of smoke, shattered trees, and human debris. Survivors often emerged completely disoriented, unable to understand what had just happened. The Germans had expected Americans to rely on brute force and numbers. Instead, they encountered industrialized precision slaughter. And as terrifying as American firepower was, it still was the thing that truly convinced Germany the war could no longer be won. That realization came when German soldiers looked behind the American front lines and saw something almost impossible to believe. By 1944, Germany was running out of everything. Fuel shortages crippled tank divisions. Ammunition became scarce. Supply lines collapsed under constant Allied bombing. Some elite German units still relied on horses to move equipment across Europe. Then they encountered the American logistics system, and it shattered morale. Captured German officers often described the same shocking sight: endless convoys of American trucks stretching for miles across the horizon. Food, fuel, medicine, spare parts, ammunition, everything arrived constantly. American soldiers received hot meals while German troops starved. U.S. units replaced damaged vehicles almost immediately while German mechanics scavenged broken equipment for scraps. Wounded American soldiers were evacuated with stunning speed while German casualties piled up in overwhelmed aid stations. Some German prisoners reportedly became emotionally devastated after seeing the scale of American supply operations firsthand, because they realized something horrifying. Germany wasn't fighting a normal country anymore. It was fighting an industrial giant capable of replacing losses faster than the Wehrmacht could inflict them. One captured German officer allegedly broke down after watching endless American truck convoys moving toward the front lines without stopping. He understood the truth immediately. The Third Reich could still win battles, but it could never outproduce the United States. America wasn't simply sending an army into Europe. It was unleashing an economic machine powerful enough to bury an entire continent under steel, gasoline, rubber, and explosives. But despite all this, some German commanders still clung to one final belief. They insisted that American soldiers themselves were still soft, that without tanks, planes, and overwhelming supplies, the Americans would eventually crack. And then came the frozen forests near the German border. By late 1944, some German commanders still believed the Americans depended entirely on machines. They argued that U.S. troops only fought well when backed by tanks, aircraft, and endless artillery support. Remove those advantages, they said, and the Americans would collapse like anyone else. Then came the Hürtgen Forest, and that illusion died in the mud. The Hürtgen was a nightmare. Dense pine forests covered steep hills near the German border. Visibility was terrible. Roads were narrow and mined. Rain turned the ground into freezing sludge. Tanks struggled to move. Aircraft could barely operate through the thick weather and trees. For the first time in months, American forces lost many of their technological advantages. What remained was pure infantry warfare, and it became one of the bloodiest battles the Americans fought in Europe. German defenders expected the Americans to eventually retreat after taking massive casualties. Entire units were ripped apart by artillery hidden inside the forest. Mines blew soldiers apart without warning. Snipers hunted movement between the trees. Men froze in foxholes filled with icy water. But the Americans kept coming. Again and again and again. Fresh divisions entered the forest only to get swallowed by the same nightmare. Casualties climbed into the tens of thousands. Entire companies vanished in the fog and woods. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand with rifles, knives, bayonets, and entrenching tools. The Germans were stunned by the sheer stubbornness of the American infantrymen. These were supposed to be the soft consumers mocked by Nazi propaganda. Yet now they were enduring conditions so brutal that even German veterans compared parts of the fighting to the horrors of the Eastern Front. The battle shattered one of Germany's final assumptions. The Americans weren't just rich, they were relentless. And then, only weeks later, Germany launched one final massive offensive that would lead to the most famous response of the entire war. In December 1944, Hitler launched his final gamble in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was bold, desperate, and incredibly risky. German armored divisions smashed through Allied lines in Belgium, hoping to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace before Germany collapsed completely. At first, the attack shocked the Americans. German tanks surged through snow-covered forests. Entire units were caught off guard. Confusion spread everywhere. Then the Germans surrounded the critical crossroads town of Bastogne. Inside the town were exhausted American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division. They were freezing, undersupplied, low on ammunition, and completely cut off. To German commanders, the situation was obvious. The Americans had no chance. According to traditional military logic, surrender was inevitable. General Hasso von Manteuffel's forces sent a formal message demanding the Americans surrender honorably to avoid total destruction. German officers expected negotiations, maybe even a white flag. Instead, they received a single word: nuts. That was the official American reply. The Germans were so confused they reportedly needed clarification on what the response even meant. Once they realized it basically translated to, "Go to hell," many were furious. But beneath the anger was something else. Disbelief. The Americans weren't acting rationally. They were surrounded by armor, freezing in the snow, running low on supplies, and still refusing to surrender. Then the situation became even worse for the Germans. The 101st Airborne held. For days, American paratroopers absorbed artillery barrages, infantry assaults, sniper fire, and armored attacks from every direction. Wounded soldiers stayed on the line. Ammunition was scavenged from the dead. Medics worked in freezing conditions while shells exploded around them nonstop. And somehow, the Americans refused to break. One paratrooper famously joked that being surrounded actually simplified things because now they could shoot at Germans in every direction. That attitude deeply unsettled the Wehrmacht. The Germans had expected fear. Instead, they found defiance. And when Patton's Third Army finally smashed through the German lines to relieve Bastogne, something inside the German high command changed permanently. For the first time, many realized the war was no longer truly winnable. But after Germany collapsed, its surviving commanders would finally admit something even more surprising. They had completely misunderstood America from the very beginning. After the war ended, Allied interrogators questioned surviving German commanders about the enemies they had faced, and many of their answers carried an uncomfortable tone of respect. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most senior military leaders, reportedly admitted that the Germans had badly underestimated the Americans. Others echoed similar views. The nation they once mocked as weak and materialistic had become the force that crushed the Third Reich from the West. But what shocked German officers most was not just America's industry. It was the culture behind the army itself. The German military tradition was built from the top down. Authority flowed through rigid hierarchies shaped by aristocratic discipline and strict obedience. America functioned differently. Its military drew strength from ordinary citizens who were encouraged to adapt, improvise, and solve problems independently. Mechanics invented battlefield modifications, junior officers rewrote plans under pressure, radio operators directed devastating artillery strikes, engineers built solutions on the fly. To many Germans, the Americans looked disorganized at first, but eventually they realized something terrifying. Chaos was actually a strength. The United States had created an army that could evolve faster than traditional European militaries could react to it.